As its name suggests, the Seafire was the navalised version of the famous Supermarine Spitfire. The idea of putting Spitfires to sea had been proposed as early as May 1938, but the aircraft was prioritised for land-based use. Aircraft for the Fleet Air Arm had been developed with the idea that, as Germany had no aircraft carriers, they would never need the highest performing aircraft, so had dual-purpose and obsolete machines, such as the Blackburn Skua and the Gloucester Sea Gladiator. In November 1939 the matter was raised again, but an order for 50 navalised Spitfires was cancelled by none other than First Lord of the Admiralty Winston Churchill, who suggested the Navy concentrate on the introduction of the Fairey Fulmer instead. In addition, Grumman Wildcats, known to the Fleet Air Arm as the Martlet, were ordered from the USA. In late 1941 it was decided to convert 48 Spitfire 5B aircraft to naval specification. These became the Seafire 1B. Changes included adding arrestor hooks, naval radios and homing beacons, and recalibrating the instruments to knots and nautical miles. More aircraft were ordered with increased strengthening in the tail, which had never been designed for arrested landings. Changes to brakes were made as well, as the majority of Fleet Air Arm home base airfields had concrete runways. The brakes of the Spitfire were designed for grass strips, with high drag helping slow the landing aircraft. On concrete, the brakes would fade and risk the aircraft simply running off the end of the runway. Following the success of the Mark 1B, over 300 Mark 5C Spitfires are converted to make the Seafire F Mark 2C. As well as the standard fighter, there were versions adapted for low-level fighting and in the fighter reconnaissance role. The first true carrier version of the Seafire was the Mark III, which introduced the folding wing. Structural reasons meant the inner fold line was just outside of the undercarriage bay. This left the wing too tall for carrier hangars, so a second fold was made just inboard the tip. The wing also featured the lightweight Hispano Mark V 20mm cannon and increased fuel capacity. By 1943, the Fleet Air Arm was searching for an even better aircraft, and the Seafire Mark 15 was developed. Based loosely on the Spitfire Mark 12, this Seafire had the new Rolls-Royce Griffon engine, a retractable tailwheel and larger rudder of the Spitfire, but retaining the Mark III's wingfold system. Later versions of the Mark 15 also replaced the underbelly A-frame type arrestor hook with the tail-mounted Stinger type. The Mark 15 suffered from poor deck handling. The Griffon engine rotated in the opposite direction to the earlier Merlin, and at full takeoff power induced a swing to the right even with full opposite rudder applied. Most of these issues were solved in the Mark 17, including the use of longer oleos in the undercarriage and better rudder authority. The Seafire 17 used the cut-down rear fuselage and bubble canopy, first tried in the very last of the Mark 15s. The stronger main wing spar required by the new undercarriage also allowed carriage of more weapons. At the end of the war, many squadrons that had been operating American types, such as the Corsair and the Hellcat, under the Lend-Lease agreement, were either disbanded or were re-equipped with the Seafire. Development continued with the F Mark 45, essentially a navalised Mark 21 Spitfire but without folding wings, and the F Mark 46 with a larger engine, contra-rotating propellers and a larger rudder. The last of the Seafire line was the FR Mark 47. This definitive carrier-borne Spitfire had contra-rotating propellers powered by a fuel-injected Griffon 88 engine and a powered wingfold mechanism with a single joint. Aircraft from 800 Naval Air Squadron used the Seafire 47 through the Malayan Emergency of 1949 and were among the first units engaged in the Korean War in 1950. Operating from the light fleet carrier HMS Triumph caused some issues, especially when a gland failure in one propeller shaft left the ship steaming only on one screw and only able to make 17 knots. Rocket-assisted takeoffs, normally shunned by naval pilots, were used extensively, as was the catapult. A trick first used during the original Seafire trials was resurrected. As on the Spitfire, the Seafire flaps are either up or down. To give a small amount of partial flap for takeoff, small wooden chocks were placed between the flaps and the wings. On takeoff, the pilot would select gear up, then quickly cycle the flaps down and up again to allow the chocks to fall away. However, the Seafire still had its characteristic weakness in the tail area. By the end of the Korean War deployment, all but 4 Seafires had been lost or grounded. Those that remained suffered significant tail buckling and were also grounded once the ship left the combat zone. The Seafire 47 was a very different aircraft to the first Seafires. Test pilot Jeffrey Quill commented that the 47 at full overload weight was equivalent to a Mark I Spitfire carrying 32 airline passengers. The Seafire 47 was withdrawn from frontline service in 1951. It was replaced either by the Hawker Sea Fury or by the new generation of naval jets such as the Supermarine Attacker. A handful of Seafires remain. In the UK there is a Seafire Mark IIIC that is airworthy, and a Seafire 17 has also rejoined the airshow scene. There's another Seafire 17 at the Fleet Air Arm Museum at Yeovilton, southwest England. There are also aircraft on display in Australia, Canada, and in the USA there is the only FR-47 still remaining. Many Seafire kits are new part modifications of existing Spitfire tooling, and I'm just going to mention a few of them. Starting in 1/32nd scale, and the Revell Seafire kit of 1969 is a modified release of their 1967 tooling, but I mention it here because it was also re-released in 1992. In 1/48th there have been 3 FX kits, all unrelated. The first was the 1996 new tool of the FR-47 Seafire, re-released in 2012, and in a much sought after 2004 box from Grand Phoenix, which comes complete with resin engine and photo etch. Then there was a Seafire L3, released in 2002, based on the 1997 new tool of the Spitfire Mark V-C. Finally, there was the Spitfire 17, made as a new tooling in 2011. This is a lovely kit which I made earlier this year. In 1991, Hobbycraft made a new tooling of the Seafire 15, and in 2009, Special Hobby released a Spitfire 3 kit in 1/48 scale, based on their Spitfire 5 of the previous year. Hasegawa released a 1/48 Seafire 1B in 2012, a new parts rebox of their 1993 kit of the Spitfire 5C. Also in 2012, Special Hobby released a new tool Seafire 15 in 1/48, a kit taken up by Revell in the following year. Moving now to 1/72nd scale, and for a comprehensive coverage of the line, look no further than Czech Master Resin, or CMR, who have released no less than 30 different kits of Seafires from 2002 to 2012. Everything should be there somewhere. But if you prefer polystyrene, then the Sword range from 2012 should have you covered. They even sold a box containing 5 different versions. Also in 1/72nd scale, Admiral released 4 Seafire kits in 2011, all variations on their own toolings, apart from the F-45, which comes from an AZ original Spitfire mould. In 2012, Special Hobby released 4 kits based on their late model Spitfire, covering the last of the Seafire range, the F-45, 46 and 47. The Korean War FR-47 includes plenty of photo etch as well. Kovazaldi Prosier for KP released a set of early Seafires in 2021. These are based on their 2016 Spitfire. And you may even be able to find a few of the J's kits of Seafires made in New Zealand in the 2000s. I know I did. These are normally found on auction sites.